Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is set to introduce a bill that would abolish the death penalty. This is in response to the Department of Justice announcement last week that the U.S. government will resume capital punishment for the first time in nearly 2 decades.
The DOJ also announced that it would schedule the execution of 5 death row inmates convicted of the torture and murder of children and the elderly. Joining us to discuss the implications of the DOJ's announcement and the court challenges that it could face is the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, Robert Dunham, a nationally recognized expert on capital punishment. Welcome back to the show, Robert.
Thank you for having me.
So, Robert, I mean, this announcement was a bit of a surprise to everybody here in D.C. Can you just tell us a little bit about the implications of it? For right now, only these 5 inmates are now scheduled for execution. How many people are on federal death row?
Well, there are 61 people who are on federal death row, 60 if you exclude the person whose death sentence was overturned and is still on appeal. But I think the big surprise here actually isn't that the Trump administration attempted to restart the death penalty. It's what took it so long. The president, during his campaign, was an active supporter of the death penalty. He has made a number of statements about expansive use of the death penalty.
Opioid dealers and such, yeah.
And so it's just a question of when.
Where's public opinion on the death penalty at this point?
Public opinion is moving away from the death penalty, although a majority of Americans still say that they support it. So in the 1990s, we had support measured at 80%. And last year in the Gallup poll it was at 55, in the Pew poll it was at 54. The interesting thing is that although a majority of Americans say they support the death penalty, when you ask them the policy question, what's the appropriate punishment for murder, and you give them options, they choose the options instead of taking the death penalty.
Well, it's interesting. Well, but I think then in that case, I mean, it makes sense. Some of these crimes are particularly horrific, you know, in terms of torturing children and the elderly. It makes sense that they would start out with these particular inmates. Just give us a sense of like who is on federal death row and what for.
Yeah. As a political matter, it makes sense, and it's interesting because there's a myth about the federal death penalty. People think that the federal death penalty is reserved for crimes like terrorism or something with a clear federal interest, a murder that happens on federal grounds, killing a federal officer, the blowing up of the Oklahoma federal building. In reality, it's not. In reality, there are a lot of different things that get you a federal death penalty. And I think it's really instructive the way that the public relations went out on the 5 death warrants. The administration stressed that killings of children, killings of the elderly, those are bad murders. But are they federal crimes? So the emphasis here is not on what the federal interest is, it's on the most inflammatory aspects of it. It turns out that when you look at the people who are on federal death row, for the most part they look the same as people who've committed state crimes. And that's been one of the criticisms, because the federal death penalty has the same issues with geographic arbitrariness, problems with representation that we see at the state level. And these are just, they look a lot like, it's hard to say ordinary when you're talking about murder. I mean, they look like serious murders, but they look much more like state crimes than they do federal crimes.
How do they make them go federal in the first place?
Well, believe it or not, most of the federal hook on these cases is through the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Yeah, I figured.
So you have
state lines.
Either cross state lines using a gun that was purchased in interstate commerce, carjacking, things along those lines. But those are classic state crimes. So the question here is less, are these people people who would be deserving of the death penalty in the state system? The question more is, why is this in the federal system at all?
Yeah. One of the things that has seemed to start to change public opinion around capital punishment was a number of very high-profile botched executions.
Yes.
What are the challenges just logistically that the federal government will face in carrying out these death penalties?
Well, this is interesting because the federal government hasn't executed anybody in 16 years. And now you have...
Who was our last execution?
The last execution was I'm blanking on the name.
Yeah.
It was a military man who had a lot of honors, but also had severe PTSD. Mr. Jones, I'm blanking on his first name. There have been 3 executions. 2001 were 2 of them, and one of them was in 2003. I believe it's Lewis Jones. What we've seen is that there's been 15 years with no executions. Now you're going to carry out 5 executions in the span of 5 weeks, 3 executions in the span of 5 days, with personnel who have not carried out any executions at all. That particular compressed schedule, if it goes forward, is a recipe for problems. You would think that you need to train people to handle this properly, and you want to make sure that they have some kind of fallback if it doesn't work. These are going to be the first executions, so you know there are going to be legal challenges. They frequently go on to the last minute, and so you've got potentially unprepared personnel facing a situation that none of them have faced in a period of 15 years.
Is there any chance SCOTUS will get involved in any of this? Because I assume all 5 are going to appeal some, last minute thing.
There's a chance, but here's what the real issue is. One of the reasons these men were selected is because they've gone through the regular appeals process.
Yeah.
So their normal course of appeals are done. The question is, do we really have a protocol in place to allow executions to happen? You can't have an execution without a legal protocol. And saying that you've got a protocol is different from having a protocol that's gone through the appropriate rulemaking process.
So they can't use the same one that they used in 2003? I mean, I don't understand why
they
it
can't.
wouldn't work. Oh, okay.
They can't, but what happened is, because there's a lawsuit that's been going on for 14 years, and they moved in the statement last week. Attorney General Barr said he was directing the Bureau of Prisons to adopt a new protocol, which was going to be a single drug, pentobarbital, the same drug that's used in Texas and Georgia and Missouri. But the difficulty as a legal matter is you can't say this is our new protocol. You have to go through the rulemaking process, and that means notice and comment, an opportunity to respond, probable court challenges after that.
Right.
And if you're going to follow the law, it's highly unlikely that all this could be in place by the time of the first scheduled executions.
What do we know about the way that race impacts sentencing in America?
Well, race impacts sentencing in everything in the criminal justice process. But with the death penalty, what we see is that there are a disproportionate number of people of color who are on death rows around the country. Now, it's interesting because when you look at the raw numbers, they tell you one story. That they say that the number of African Americans and Latinos on death row is disproportionate to the population. That's the wrong measurement. You have to take a look at the proportion of minorities on death row as compared to the proportion of murders that are committed by blacks or Latinos. But what we really see is that there are 2 stages in which discrimination occurs. The first is who gets capitally prosecuted, what kind of case, and there we see a victim preference, if you will. And that's where you get the argument that black lives don't matter, because you are much more likely to be capitally prosecuted if you've committed an offense against a white person, and particularly against a white woman. But when you take the cases and you divide them then into here's this box, white victims, here's this box, black victims, here's this box, Latino victims, in every single one of those boxes you see that people of color disproportionately are sentenced to death.
Does that include on the federal death row?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And so where does the process, I guess, go from here? Does it just mean that we're going to have to see endless legal challenges on the legal protocol about the death? Because that seems like something that could take years.
Well, I don't think it'll be endless protocol challenges. The lawyers who filed the lawsuit for the prisoners as a whole have already said that they're going to include this new protocol in the challenge.
Okay.
The 5 people who have death warrants are not part of that class action. So I would expect that they will try to join it. But because you have to have rules in place, that will certainly be challenged. It'll be interesting to see, given the actions of the Supreme Court on the death warrant cases last term, where every time they ruled in favor of the state allowing an execution to go forward, it'll be interesting to see how seriously the Supreme Court takes the process. Because as we've often said, if you're going to have a death penalty, the ultimate in the law, I think it's critical that we follow the law. We dot every I, cross every T, and make sure that the system is beyond reproach. Here, this process, trying to have this compressed system where you're going to move to execution in December and January, doesn't look like it allows for meaningful consideration of whether it's an appropriate protocol, whether they have the drugs, whether they got the drugs legally, whether a compounding pharmacy has appropriate health and safety records. We just don't know that. And that will all play out in a very short period of time.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Great to have your expertise, Robert. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Next on Rising, the Mueller investigation is over, but the scrutiny of some of the resources used in it are not.
A Ukrainian journalist and parliament member explains to Hill TV's John Solomon how he came across a document called the Black Ledger and what exactly it has to do with Paul Manafort. That when Rising continues.